The Arizona Territory, 1883. A time when the desert could swallow a man's dreams as easily as a flash flood. When survival meant trusting no one but yourself and the horse beneath you. This is the extraordinary story of Marcus Thompson, a solitary cowboy whose own shattered past led him down a forgotten canyon trail on the hottest day of summer, where the sound of crying infants would change everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the true meaning of home. 12 innocent lives abandoned to the merciless sun, and one broken man who would risk everything to save them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung like a merciless eye above the Sonoran Desert, its rays turning sand into shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon into impossible mirages. Marcus Thompson pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare as his horse picked its way carefully down the rocky slope of Devil's Canyon. The chestnut mare beneath him moved with the steady patience of an animal accustomed to hard travel, her hooves finding purchase on loose stone with practiced ease. At 34, Marcus bore the weathered appearance of a man who had spent more years under open sky than beneath any roof. His face was deeply tanned, marked by lines that spoke of constant exposure to wind and sun. A thick mustache, auburn touched with premature gray, shadowed his mouth, and his blue eyes held the distant quality of someone who had learned to watch horizons rather than seek human company. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, sturdy denim pants, a cotton shirt faded to pale blue, leather chaps scored by thorns and rough use, and boots worn smooth by countless hours in the stirrup. Marcus had been riding alone for the better part of 6 years now, ever since the fever took his wife Catherine and their newborn son in the same terrible week back in Tucson. The memory of that loss had driven him from settled life into the vast emptiness of the territory, where a man could ride for days without seeing another soul, where the only sounds were wind through rock formations and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. He made his living as most solitary men did in those days, hiring out his skills where they were needed. He could break horses, mend fences, track strays, and handle a gun well enough to discourage trouble. Ranch owners appreciated his quiet competence and his willingness to take on jobs that required weeks alone on the range. He asked for little beyond fair wages and the freedom to move on when the work was done or when staying in one place. Too long brought back memories he preferred to keep buried. The canyon he traveled now was known only to a few, a shortcut between the Verde River settlements and the mining camps near Globe. Most riders avoided it, claiming the walls were too steep and the water sources too unreliable. But Marcus had used this route before, and he knew that the small spring hidden among the cottonwoods at the canyon's heart provided the sweetest water for 50 miles in any direction. His mare, Copper, needed rest after 3 hard days crossing the high desert, and he intended to spend the hottest part of the day in whatever shade the narrow canyon might provide. The trail wound deeper into the gorge, walls rising on either side like cathedral spires carved from red stone. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, though it remained brutally hot by any reasonable standard. Marcus could hear water trickling somewhere ahead, the spring that marked the canyon's heart and his intended destination. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Copper suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward in sharp attention. Marcus felt her muscles tense beneath him, and he automatically reached for the Winchester rifle secured to his saddle. In a country like this, alertness meant survival. A mountain lion, a rattlesnake, even another traveler could spell danger for the unwary. But what reached his ears was something he had never expected to hear in this remote place. The unmistakable sound of crying. Not the cry of an animal, but something distinctly human. High-pitched, desperate, and heartbreakingly fragile. Marcus reined Copper to a halt, listening intently. The sound came again, carried on the still air like an accusation against the silence. More than one voice, he realized with growing alarm. Multiple sources of distress echoing off the canyon walls. He dismounted quickly, ground-tying Copper with the confidence of long partnership. The mare would remain where he left her, trained by years of necessity to stand regardless of what might unfold around her. Marcus drew his rifle and moved forward on foot, following the sound through a stand of desert willow toward the hidden spring. What he discovered there would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. In a natural clearing beside the spring, arranged with heartbreaking care beneath a rough shelter of canvas and mesquite branches, lay 12 infants. They ranged in age from newborns to perhaps 6 months, their tiny faces red from crying and exposure to the heat. Some lay still, too exhausted to continue their protests, while others wailed with the desperate energy of children fighting for survival itself. The shelter was clearly makeshift but had been constructed by someone who cared enough to try. Canvas, probably torn from a wagon cover, had been stretched between trees to provide some protection from the direct sun. Blankets, worn but clean, had been arranged to create individual beds for each child. Empty water jugs and the remnants of what appeared to be prepared bottles suggested that whoever had left them here had tried to provide for their immediate needs. But in the desert heat, even the best preparations would last only hours. The water was gone, the makeshift bottles empty, and the infants were clearly suffering from dehydration and exposure. Some of the smaller ones had stopped crying altogether, lying frighteningly still in the sweltering air. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 12 babies, abandoned in one of the most remote spots in the territory. Who would do such a thing? And why? A piece of paper, weighted down with a small stone, caught his attention. He knelt beside it, careful not to disturb the nearest infant, a dark-haired little girl whose chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The note was written in a woman's careful script, the ink smudged but still legible. 2. Whoever finds these precious souls, we are the survivors of a wagon train attacked by bandits 3 days past. Our supplies are gone, our men dead, and we women face a terrible journey with no certainty of survival. These children deserve better than to perish in the desert because of our misfortune. The spring here runs clean and true. We have left what food and water we could spare. If God is merciful, someone will find them before it is too late. Their names and ages are written on the cloth tied to each child's wrist. Please, if you have any Christian mercy in your heart, save them. We go now to try to reach help, knowing we may not survive the attempt. May God forgive us and bless these innocent ones. Margaret Whitmore, on behalf of the surviving women of the Henderson wagon train. Marcus read the note twice, his hands trembling slightly as the full magnitude of the situation settled over him. A wagon train attack. Desperate women are forced to make an impossible choice. 12 babies left with nothing but hope and prayer for salvation. He looked around the clearing again, this time noticing details that spoke of the agony this decision must have caused. Personal items, a small wooden toy horse, a delicate christening gown, a child's silver spoon, had been tucked in with some of the infants. These were not unwanted children being discarded, but beloved little ones being entrusted to fate when all other options had been exhausted. One of the babies, a boy who appeared to be perhaps 4 months old, had worked his tiny fist free of his blanket and was making weak grasping motions in the air. Marcus knelt beside him and the infants. Fingers immediately closed around his offered thumb with surprising strength. The child's eyes, a startling green, focused on Marcus's face with the desperate intensity of someone who understood, however dimly, that his survival depended on the kindness of this stranger. The reality of the situation crashed over Marcus like a physical blow. 12 infants. All of them are in various stages of distress. No supplies beyond what he carried in his saddlebags. The nearest settlement is at least 2 days' hard ride away. And him, a man who had spent 6 years avoiding human contact, who had no experience with children beyond the son he had lost before he could even hold him properly. But as he looked down at the tiny hand gripping his thumb, as he heard the desperate cries of the other children echoing off the canyon walls, Marcus felt something stir within him that had been dormant since Catherine's death. Not just compassion, though that was certainly present, but a fierce protective instinct that seemed to come from somewhere, deeper than conscious thought. These children had been entrusted to fate. And fate, it seemed, had led him down this particular trail on this particular day. Whether by chance or divine providence, he was here. He was all they had. Marcus gently extracted his thumb from the infant's grasp and stood, his mind already working through the immediate challenges. Water first, the spring would provide that. Shade, the existing shelter would have to do, though it needed improvement. Food, he had emergency rations in his saddlebags, though nothing suitable for infants. And then the larger problem, how to get 12 babies to safety across some of the most unforgiving country in the American West. He moved among the children, checking each one as best he could with his limited knowledge. Most were awake now, disturbed by his presence and the hope it represented. Several had cloth strips tied around their wrists, just as the note had indicated. He read the names written there in the same careful hand. Thomas, age 6 months. Mary, age 3 months. Samuel, 4 months. Elizabeth, 2 months. The list went on, each name representing a small life hanging in the balance. The youngest appeared to be twin girls, perhaps only weeks old, who lay frighteningly still in their shared blanket. Marcus touched the forehead of one and found her skin hot and dry, the dangerous signs of severe dehydration. If he was going to save any of these children, he would have to act quickly and decisively. Returning to where Copper waited patiently, Marcus began unloading his saddlebags with methodical efficiency. He had been traveling light, as was his custom, but years of desert survival had taught him to carry certain essentials. A large canvas tarp for emergency shelter, several water containers, jerky and hardtack that could be softened with water, basic medical supplies including laudanum for pain and fever. Not much to work with, but it would have to suffice. He filled his largest container from the spring, noting with relief that the water ran clear and cold, despite the surface heat. The spring was fed by underground sources, protected from contamination and reliable even in the driest years. At least water would not be a problem. Returning to the children, Marcus began the delicate work of providing immediate care. Using torn strips from his spare shirt, he fashioned crude but functional feeding cloths, soaking them with water and allowing the infants to suck moisture from the fabric. It was primitive, but it was better than nothing, and several of the children responded immediately to the relief of cool water against their parched lips. The older infants, those around 6 months, were able to take small amounts of softened hardtack mixed with water. It was far from ideal nutrition, but it would provide some sustenance until he could devise a better solution. The youngest ones presented the greatest challenge. They needed milk, and that was something he simply could not provide in the middle of the desert. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus worked with the focused intensity of a man who understood that lives hung in the balance of every decision. He improved the shelter, using his tarp to create better shade and windbreak. He organized the children by age and condition, keeping the sickest ones closest to the spring where he could monitor them most carefully. Slowly, as water and shade began to work their restorative magic, the desperate crying subsided into the more normal fussing of uncomfortable, but no longer critical infants. Color began to return to several small faces. The twin girls, after being carefully hydrated with drops of water placed on their lips, showed signs of improvement that filled Marcus with cautious hope. But as the sun began its descent toward the western rim of the canyon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Marcus faced the brutal truth of their situation. He had perhaps stabilized the immediate crisis, but 12 infants could not survive long in the desert on emergency rations and spring water. They needed proper food, medical care, and transportation to civilization, and that meant making one of the most difficult decisions of his life. He could attempt to ride for help, leaving the children with improved shelter and what supplies he could spare. But 2 days to the nearest settlement, 2 days back, and no guarantee that he could convince anyone to mount a rescue operation for abandoned babies. The children might not survive his absence, or he could attempt something that seemed almost impossible: load all 12 infants onto his horse and his own back, and try to carry them to safety himself. The journey would be slow, dangerous, and might kill them all. But at least they would face that danger together, and he would be there to protect them from the other hazards that stalked the desert: wild animals, extreme weather, and the simple but deadly possibility of becoming lost in a country that looked the same in every direction. As night began to fall over Devil's Canyon, Marcus Thompson sat beside the spring, surrounded by 12 tiny lives that had been placed in his care by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Tomorrow would bring choices that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, endurance, and the lengths to which one man might go to honor an unspoken promise to the innocent. The stars emerged one by one in the clear desert sky, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack. But in the small circle of safety that Marcus had created beside the spring, 12 babies slept more peacefully than they had since being left to face the desert alone. The rescue had begun. Dawn arrived, with the gradual lightening that characterized desert mornings, the sky shifting from black to deep purple to pale gold, as the sun prepared to reclaim its dominion over the canyon. Marcus had dozed fitfully through the night, jerking awake at every sound from the infants, checking on each child multiple times by the light of the small fire he had built well away from the makeshift nursery. The night had brought its own challenges. Desert temperatures plummeted after sunset, and keeping 12 babies warm without proper blankets or adequate shelter had required constant vigilance. Marcus had rotated between the children, moving the smallest ones closer to his body heat. When their breathing became too shallow, adjusting coverings, and continuing the careful process of hydration that seemed to be slowly bringing them back from the brink. 3 of the infants had particularly concerned him through the dark hours. The twin girls, who couldn't be more than a month old, remained frighteningly fragile despite his efforts. Their breathing was rapid and shallow, and they barely responded to stimulation. A boy of perhaps 3 months, identified by his wrist band as Jonathan, had developed a worrying cough that echoed harshly in the pre-dawn silence. Each labored breath reminded Marcus of just how precarious their situation remained, but there had been encouraging signs as well. Several of the older babies had shown remarkable resilience once rehydrated. A 6-month-old girl named Rebecca had actually managed something resembling a smile when Marcus offered her more softened hardtack, and a sturdy boy called Michael had spent part of the night making the soft cooing sounds that suggested contentment rather than distress. As full daylight began to penetrate the canyon, Marcus found himself facing the decision he had postponed through the long night. The children were stabilized for now, but barely. They needed proper food, medical attention, and transportation to civilization. Every hour of delay increased the likelihood that the weakest among them would not survive. He walked to the edge of the clearing where Copper grazed on the sparse grass near the spring, her reins trailing loose in the way of a perfectly trained cow horse. The Maori looked up at his approach, and Marcus could swear he saw understanding in her dark eyes. She had carried him through 6 years of solitary wandering, and now she would be asked to do something unprecedented: help transport 12 helpless infants across hostile territory. Marcus ran his hands along Copper's sides and back, assessing her condition for the ordeal ahead. She was a strong horse, bred for endurance rather than speed, with the deep chest and sturdy legs that marked the best of the frontier stock. At 14 hands, she wasn't the largest mount he had ever owned, but she possessed an intelligence and steady temperament that had saved his life more than once in difficult situations. "Well, girl," he murmured against her neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and leather that had been his constant companion for so long. "Looks like we've got ourselves a different kind of job this time." Returning to the children, Marcus began a more thorough assessment of each infant's condition and needs. The note from Margaret Whitmore had provided names and approximate ages, but he needed to understand their individual requirements for the journey ahead. Some were clearly stronger than others, better able to tolerate the stress of travel. Others would need constant monitoring and care. He started with the oldest, a 6-month-old boy named David, who had shown good responsiveness to water and food. The child was alert, following Marcus's movements with curious eyes, and had maintained body temperature well through the night. David would likely be one of the easier passengers for the journey ahead. Next came Rebecca, the girl who had smiled. She appeared to be about 5 months old, with reddish hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that reminded Marcus painfully of his lost son. Rebecca had taken water eagerly and seemed to possess the kind of robust constitution that suggested she might weather the ordeal ahead better than some of her companions. The inventory continued through children of various ages and conditions. Some, like 4-month-old Samuel and 3-month-old Mary, showed promise of surviving the journey if carefully managed. Others, particularly the youngest, would require extreme measures and constant attention. But it was when Marcus reached the twin girls that the true magnitude of his challenge became clear. They lay together in their shared blanket, breathing in the rapid, shallow pattern that spoke of bodies struggling against dehydration and exposure. Their skin had the waxy appearance of severe distress, and they barely responded when he gently touched their tiny hands. These two, probably no more than 3 or 4 weeks old, represented the greatest challenge he faced. They needed milk, not water. They needed warmth that his limited resources could barely provide. Most critically, they needed medical attention that was days away at the nearest settlement. Yet looking down at their fragile faces, Marcus knew he could not abandon them any more than he could abandon the stronger children. The practical problem seemed almost insurmountable. How to carry 12 infants on horseback across terrain that challenged experienced riders traveling light. How to provide adequate food and water for the journey. How to protect them from the sun, wind, and temperature extremes they would encounter. And perhaps most daunting of all, how to manage the logistics of feeding, changing, and comforting 12 babies while maintaining the pace necessary to reach help before the weakest one succumbed. Marcus had never considered himself a particularly inventive man, but necessity began to spark ideas that bordered on inspiration. The large tarp that had improved their shelter could be fashioned into a kind of hammock or carrier system. His spare rope, normally used for securing loads or emergency repairs, could create a framework for distributing weight. The saddlebags could be modified to carry the smallest infants close to his body, where their warmth could help sustain them. But first, he needed to address the immediate problem of nutrition. The softened hardtack and water were barely adequate for the older children, and completely insufficient for the youngest. Marcus found himself thinking back to his days working cattle ranches, remembering the various animals and their care. Goat's milk was closer to human milk than cow's milk for infants, but there were no goats in this desert wilderness. However, there were other possibilities. He had noticed signs of wildlife around the spring, deer tracks in the mud, the droppings of various small animals, and most importantly, evidence that this water source supported more life than was immediately visible. Where there was permanent water in the desert, there were often animals that could provide what the children needed. Leaving the infants in their improved shelter, Marcus took his rifle and began a careful scouting mission around the canyon. He wasn't looking for large game. Even if he could bring down a deer, it would provide meat rather than the milk the babies required. Instead, he searched for signs of smaller mammals that might be nursing young of their own. What he found exceeded his hopes. In a sheltered alcove, perhaps 200 yards from the spring, he discovered evidence of a small herd of desert bighorn sheep, not the massive rams of the high country, but the smaller, more adaptable animals that survived in the harsh landscape of the Sonoran Desert. Fresh droppings and hoofprints suggested they watered here regularly, probably in the early morning hours when the canyon was coolest. More importantly, the tracks included the smaller prints of lambs, which meant nursing ewes. If he could manage to capture or kill one of the mothers, her milk could mean the difference between life and death for the youngest infants. The ethical complexity of the quorum of the mothers. Her milk could mean the difference between life and death for the youngest infants. The ethical complexity of the young situation was not lost on Marcus. Taking a nursing away would likely doom her lamb, trading one young life for potentially several others. But the arithmetic of survival was stark. The sheep had a chance in the wild, while the abandoned human infants had none without intervention. He spent the morning hours preparing for what would need to be both a hunt and a race against time. Using materials from his kit and improvised tools, Marcus constructed a series of carriers that could be secured to Copper's saddle and his own body. The largest would hold the older, stronger infants. Smaller pouches, lined with pieces of his spare clothing for warmth and cushioning, would carry the most fragile children against his chest, where he could monitor their breathing and provide body heat. The work was painstaking and required innovation at every step. Marcus had to consider weight distribution, access for feeding and care, protection from sun and wind, and the simple but critical need to prevent any child from falling during what would be a challenging journey over rough terrain. By midday, when the sun reached its peak intensity and drove most desert creatures to whatever shade they could find, Marcus had completed his preparations for departure. The carrier system was crude but functional. His supplies were organized for maximum efficiency. Most importantly, he had located the sheep trail and identified the most likely spot for an encounter. The bighorns appeared just as the afternoon heat began to moderate, moving down the canyon wall along paths invisible to human eyes. Marcus watched from concealment as the small herd approached the spring. 3 ewes, 2 yearlings, and a magnificent ram whose curved horns spoke of years surviving in this harsh environment. The shot, when it came, was clean and quick. Marcus had chosen the smallest of the nursing ewes, judging her to be the mother of only one lamb rather than twins. The animal dropped without suffering, and the rest of the herd bounded away up the canyon walls with the incredible agility that allowed their species to thrive in seemingly impossible terrain. The work that followed was unpleasant, but necessary. Marcus had butchered animals before, but never with such urgency or for such a purpose. He needed the milk first, drawing it carefully into one of his water containers. The meat would provide emergency rations, though he had no way to preserve it in the desert heat beyond cutting it into strips that could be dried quickly in the sun. When he returned to the infants with the precious milk, the improvement in the youngest children was almost immediate. The twin girls, fed drops of the warm liquid from pieces of cloth, showed more responsiveness than they had since his arrival. Their breathing became less labored, their skin regained some of its natural color, and for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to believe that all 12 children might survive the ordeal ahead. The remainder of the afternoon was spent in final preparations for departure. Marcus wanted to travel during the cooler evening hours and through the night, when the desert temperatures would be more bearable for the infants. He loaded the children into their improvised carriers with infinite care, ensuring each was as comfortable and secure as possible for the journey ahead. The largest carrier, Suspended from Copper's saddle, held 5 of the older children. They were packed carefully with blankets between them, secured, but not cramped, positioned so that he could check on them regularly during travel. A second carrier, worn across his back like an enormous pack, held 4 more infants of middle age and condition, the 3 youngest and most fragile. The twin girls and little Jonathan, with his worrying cough, rode in pouches strapped to his chest. Their weight was significant, but their proximity allowed him to monitor their breathing, provide warmth from his body, and respond immediately if any showed signs of distress. As the sun began its descent toward the western rim of Devil's Canyon, Marcus Thompson prepared to attempt something that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was about to try to transport 12 helpless infants across 50 miles of some of the most dangerous territory in the American West. With nothing but his horse, his wits, and a determination born of desperation, the children seemed to sense the change coming. Those old enough to be aware of their surroundings watched him with the trust that only the very young can offer to adults. The smaller ones nestled against the warmth he provided, their breathing synchronized with his heartbeat in a rhythm that spoke of life. Continuing against all odds, Copper stood patient and ready, loaded with precious cargo unlike any she had ever carried. The Mare's ears were pricked forward, alert but calm, as if she understood the gravity of her new responsibility. Marcus took one last look around the canyon that had sheltered them through the crisis of discovery and initial rescue. The spring continued its quiet music, indifferent to human drama. The walls of red stone caught the last light of day, transforming them into something almost cathedral-like in their beauty and permanence. Somewhere out there, perhaps still traveling toward help that might come too late, were the women who had made the impossible choice to leave these children behind. Marcus said a silent prayer that Margaret Whitmore and her companions had found safety, and that someday they might learn that their desperate gamble had succeeded. Then he swung into the saddle with careful precision, mindful of the tiny lives depending on his every movement. The weight was significant but manageable, the balance different but workable. Copper shifted slightly under the unusual load but showed no signs of distress or reluctance. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Marcus Thompson rode out of Devil's Canyon carrying 12 abandoned babies toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them lay the scene of crisis and discovery. Ahead stretched the most challenging journey of his life, a race against time, elements, and the simple biological needs of infants who had already survived more than anyone should have asked of them. The rescue had entered its most dangerous phase, but it was no longer a rescue of desperation. It had become a rescue of hope, determination, and the kind of courage that emerges when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances, and refuse to surrender to the impossible. The first hours of travel proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. What he had envisioned as a steady trek through the cooling desert night became a constant exercise in adaptation and problem-solving. Every few hundred yards brought new adjustments as the infants settled into their carriers, as Copper adapted to her unusual cargo, and as the realities of moving 12 babies across rough terrain revealed complications he hadn't foreseen. The trail out of Devil's Canyon was treacherous enough under normal circumstances. In darkness, carrying precious and fragile cargo, it demanded a level of concentration that left Marcus's nerves stretched taut. Copper picked her way up the rocky slope with the careful precision of a cat, but even her sure-footed navigation couldn't prevent the occasional stumble that sent Marcus's heart racing as he checked to ensure none of the children had been jarred too roughly. By the time they reached the canyon rim, Marcus had already made his first major modification to the transport system. The youngest twins, riding against his chest, were struggling with the motion of horseback travel. Their breathing had become labored again, and one had begun the weak crying that spoke of genuine distress. After 20 minutes of increasing concern, Marcus dismounted and rearranged the chest carriers, placing additional padding around the tiny bodies and adjusting their position to reduce the jarring effects of Copper's gait. The modification worked, but it cost precious time and revealed a troubling pattern. The infants were more fragile than he had hoped, less resilient to the stresses of travel. What he had planned as a rapid journey to reach help within 2 days might need to become a more cautious progression with frequent stops for adjustment and care. The desert landscape that spread before them under starlight was both beautiful and forbidding. Rolling hills of sand and scattered rock formation stretched to the horizon, broken by the darker lines of dry washes and the occasional shadow that marked a stand of mesquite or palo verde. In daylight, a rider could navigate by landmarks, distinctive rock spires, the distant outline of mountain ranges, the subtle variations in vegetation that marked water sources. But in darkness, with 12 infants depending on his navigation skills, Marcus had to rely on his compass and his memory of this country. He had traveled this general route before, though never with such urgent purpose. The trading post at Willow Springs lay approximately 45 miles northeast of Devil's Canyon, a journey that normally took him a day and a half of steady riding. With frequent stops for infant care and the slower pace dictated by his precious cargo, he estimated the trip would require at least 3 days, assuming no major complications arose. The first complication came sooner than expected. They had been traveling for perhaps 3 hours when one of the older children in the main carrier began crying with increasing intensity. At first, Marcus assumed it was simply discomfort from the motion, but the crying continued and seemed to be spreading to the other infants in the group. He dismounted beside a cluster of barrel cacti, using their bulk to provide some wind protection. While he investigated, by lamplight, he discovered that 4-month-old Samuel had developed what appeared to be severe colic. The child's tiny stomach was distended, and he was drawing his legs up in obvious pain. More concerning, his distress was beginning to affect the other children in ways that threatened to create a cascade of crying that could be heard for miles across the desert. Marcus had limited experience with infant ailments, but his years of caring for sick animals had taught him that digestive problems often responded to gentle massage and changes in position. Working by feel as much as sight, he carefully extracted Samuel from the carrier and placed him against his shoulder, rubbing the tiny back in slow circles while walking slowly back and forth beside Copper. The technique seemed to help. After several minutes of gentle motion and massage, Samuel's crying subsided to occasional whimpers, and Marcus felt what might have been a small burp against his shoulder. He waited another 10 minutes to ensure the crisis had passed before carefully settling the infant back into his carrier, this time in a slightly different position that seemed to ease his discomfort. But the delay had cost them nearly an hour, and Marcus began to understand that such interruptions would be frequent throughout the journey. Each child had individual needs and responses to the stress of travel. What worked for one might not work for another, and the constant vigilance required to monitor their condition would make rapid progress impossible. As they resumed travel, Marcus found himself developing a rhythm that balanced speed with care. He checked the children every half hour, both by sight and by feel, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated comfort or distress. The chest-mounted twins he could monitor constantly, feeling their breathing patterns and body temperature through the fabric of their carriers. The others required visual inspection and occasional hands-on assessment. Copper, for her part, seemed to understand the importance of her cargo. The Mare's gait became even more measured than usual, her movements deliberate and smooth. When the trail offered choices between faster but rougher paths and slower but gentler routes, she consistently chose the latter without guidance from Marcus. It was as if the horse had appointed herself as protector of the tiny passengers she carried. The desert night brought its own challenges beyond navigation and infant care. As the temperature continued to drop, Marcus found himself constantly adjusting blankets and positioning to keep the children warm. The smallest ones, particularly the twins, seemed to lose body heat rapidly despite being pressed against his chest. He began to worry that the cold might prove as dangerous as the heat had been during the day. Around midnight, they encountered their first external threat. The sound came first, a long, mournful howl that echoed across the desert landscape and was answered by another closer call. Coyotes. Marcus had dealt with the scavengers before, and under normal circumstances would have considered them more nuisance than danger. But with 12 helpless infants whose scent might attract the pack's attention, the situation became more serious. Copper's ears pricked forward, and Marcus felt her muscles tense beneath him. The Mare was alert but not panicked. She had faced coyotes before. Marcus reached for his rifle, checking that it was loaded and easily accessible. The Winchester held 15 rounds, more than enough to discourage a pack of desert scavengers, but he hoped it wouldn't come to shooting. Gunfire would terrify the children and might attract other predators. The coyotes followed them for nearly an hour, their calls echoing from different directions as the pack paralleled their path. Marcus caught occasional glimpses of gray shapes, moving through the brush, always staying just beyond clear sight. The predators were curious about the unusual procession, but seemed hesitant to approach too closely. Perhaps Copper's size deterred them, or perhaps the mixed sense of human and infant confused their hunting instincts. Eventually, the calls faded into the distance as the pack found easier prey or simply lost interest. But the encounter reminded Marcus of how vulnerable they were to the dangers that stalked the desert night. Mountain lions, bears, even rattlesnakes posed threats that his precious cargo would be helpless to escape. Dawn brought relief from the cold and the predators, but introduced new challenges. As the sun climbed above the eastern horizon, Marcus realized they had made less progress than he had hoped. The frequent stops for infant care, the cautious pace dictated by rough terrain, and the hour lost to Samuel's colic had combined to reduce their distance traveled to perhaps 12 miles, barely a quarter of the total journey. More troubling was the condition of some of the children. The twin girls, despite being kept warm against his chest throughout the night, seemed weaker than they had been at departure. Their breathing remained rapid and shallow, and they showed little response to stimulation. Little Jonathan's cough had worsened, developing a harsh quality that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of pneumonia in cattle. As the temperature began to rise with the strengthening sun, Marcus faced a crucial decision. He could push forward, hoping to make better time in daylight when navigation was easier, but risk exposing the infants to the killing heat of a desert day. Or he could seek shelter and rest through the hottest hours, preserving the children's strength but losing precious time in reaching help. The decision was made for him when 6-month-old Rebecca, who had been one of the stronger children, began showing signs of heat distress despite the early hour. Her face flushed red, her breathing became rapid, and she seemed to have trouble focusing her eyes. Marcus immediately sought shade beneath a large palo verde tree, dismounting and beginning the process of cooling the overheated infant with drops of precious water. As he worked to bring Rebecca's temperature down, Marcus surveyed their surroundings with growing concern. They were still at least 30 miles from Willow Springs, with no guaranteed water sources between their current position and safety. His water supplies, carefully rationed, would last perhaps 2 more days if the children's needs didn't increase. The sheep's milk that had been so crucial for the youngest infants was already running low, but it was while checking on the other children that Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. Young David, the 6-month-old who had shown such resilience, was not in his carrier. The straps that should have secured him were still fastened, but the space where he should have been was empty. Panic seized Marcus as he searched frantically through all the carriers, hoping against hope that David had somehow shifted position, or that his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. But the terrible truth was undeniable. Somewhere during the night's journey, one of the children had been lost. Marcus's mind raced back through the hours of travel, trying to pinpoint when and where David might have fallen. The colic episode. With Samuel, the coyote encounter when his attention was divided between the pack and navigation. One of the many brief stops to check on the children. The possibilities were endless, and each represented miles of desert that would need to be searched. The practical implications were devastating. Marcus couldn't abandon 11 children to search for one, but neither could he continue forward knowing that David might be lying somewhere along their trail, alone and helpless in the growing heat. Every minute of delay reduced the lost child's chances of survival, but every minute spent searching endangered the remaining 11. As if sensing his distress, Copper turned her head to look back at him, her dark eyes questioning. The mare had carried them faithfully through the dangerous night, adapting to her unusual cargo with remarkable grace. Now she seemed to be asking what came next, what decision her human partner would make in this impossible situation. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, fighting down the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He had taken responsibility for 12 lives, and now one was missing. The weight of that failure threatened to crush his spirit, but he couldn't afford to collapse under guilt when 11 children still depended on him. Opening his eyes, Marcus began to study the terrain they had covered, using the rising sun to orient himself and trace their probable path. If David had fallen during the early part of the journey, when they were still climbing out of Devil's Canyon, he would be in rocky terrain with some shade and protection. If the loss had occurred later, in the open desert, the child's chances diminished rapidly with each passing hour. Then Marcus noticed something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Copper's tracks in the sandy soil told a story he hadn't considered. In several places, the mare's hoofprints showed deviations from the straight path, small detours that brought her closer to rocks or desert plants that might provide shelter. Could Copper have known? Could the horse's instincts have detected David's fall and led her to deposit the unconscious or sleeping child in a place of relative safety? It seemed incredible, but Marcus had seen horses display remarkable intelligence in crisis situations. And Copper had been unusually careful throughout the night, choosing easier paths and maintaining an extraordinarily smooth gait. With new purpose, Marcus began the agonizing process of retracing their route, checking each spot where Copper's tracks showed deviation from the main path. He couldn't take all 11 remaining children on this search. The risk to them was too great. Instead, he created a temporary shelter using his tarp and what shade the palo verde provided, ensuring the children had water and protection from the mounting heat. "Stay with them, girl," he told Copper, settling the mare in the shade beside the makeshift nursery. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Taking only his rifle, a water container, and a burning determination to find the missing child, Marcus began to walk back along their trail, following the story written in hoofprints and hoping against hope that David was still alive somewhere in the vastness of the desert dawn. Marcus had been walking backward along their trail for nearly 2 hours when he found the first clue. A small piece of blue fabric, no larger than his thumb, caught on a thorny ocotillo branch about 8 feet from where Copper's tracks showed a distinctive pause. His heart hammered as he recognized the material. It was from David's tiny shirt, the same pale blue cotton that had been wrapped around the 6-month-old when Marcus first discovered him. The fabric was fresh, not yet faded by sun or weathered by wind. More importantly, it was positioned at exactly the height where a small body might brush against the plant if being carried. Marcus studied the ground around the ocotillo with desperate intensity, looking for any sign that might indicate where David had gone from this point. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The sand around the base of the plant showed disturbed patterns, not the random scuffing of wind, but the deliberate markings of something large dragging a burden. The tracks led away from the main trail, winding between stands of cholla cactus, toward a series of low hills perhaps half a mile distant. Animal tracks. Large paws with the distinctive asymmetrical pattern, that marked them as feline rather than canine. A mountain lion had found David. Marcus checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered and the safety was off. Mountain lions rarely attacked humans, preferring easier prey, but a helpless infant would present no threat and little challenge. If the big cat had carried David away, time was running out in ways Marcus didn't want to contemplate. Following the tracks required every skill he had learned in his years working cattle and hunting in rough country. The lion was clever, using rocky ground where possible to obscure its path, taking advantage of natural features that would hide its passage. But the burden it carried, assuming David was still alive when taken, would slow it down and force it to rest periodically. The trail led steadily upward into the hills, winding between boulders and through narrow passages that spoke of the CAT's intimate knowledge of this territory. Marcus moved as quickly as he dared, knowing that speed might mean the difference between rescue and tragedy, but also understanding that a careless step could send him tumbling down a rocky slope with a broken leg or worse. It was the silence that told him he was close. The normal sounds of desert morning, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the brush, had ceased entirely. In the predator's immediate territory, other creatures knew to remain invisible and quiet. Marcus crested a small ridge and found himself looking down into a natural amphitheater formed by weathered rock formations. At the center, in a patch of shade beneath an overhanging boulder, lay the mountain lion. The big cat was perhaps 7 feet from nose to tail, lean but powerful, with the tawny coat that made it nearly invisible against the desert stone. And there, miracle of miracles, was David. The infant lay unharmed beneath the boulder, crying weakly but definitely alive. The mountain lion wasn't feeding, it was protecting. The great cat had positioned itself between the child and any approach, but showed no signs of having harmed David. Instead, it seemed to be guarding him. Marcus had heard of such things but never witnessed them. Occasionally, particularly among cats that had lost cubs of their own, maternal instincts could override hunting behavior when confronted with helpless young. This lioness, for he could now see the narrower head and smaller frame that marked her as female, had apparently adopted David rather than viewing him as prey. The situation presented challenges Marcus had never imagined facing. The lioness was clearly protective of the infant, but she was still a wild predator. Any approach might trigger an attack, endangering both David and himself. Yet leaving the child in the cat's care was not an option. Even the most protective wild animal could not provide the food and medical attention David needed to survive. Marcus positioned himself behind a large boulder, using it as both concealment and potential protection. From this vantage point, he could see that David appeared uninjured, but was showing signs of dehydration and exposure. The infant's crying was weak and intermittent, his movements sluggish. Time was running out. The lioness had noticed his presence, though she showed no immediate signs of aggression. Her ears were forward, alert but not flattened in anger. Her tail twitched occasionally, but she remained in her protective position beside David. She was clearly aware of Marcus but had not yet decided whether he represented a threat to her adopted charge. Marcus began to speak softly, using the same gentle tone he employed with nervous horses. He had no idea whether the big cat could be reasoned with, but maintaining a calm, non-threatening demeanor seemed like the wisest approach. Slowly, carefully, he began to remove items from his kit: jerky, hardtack, even some of the precious sheep's milk in a small container. The lioness watched his movements with intense interest, particularly when he produced the milk. Her nostrils flared as she caught the scent, and for the first time, she vocalized a low rumbling sound that was neither growl nor purr, but something between the two. Understanding flickered in Marcus's mind. The lioness was lactating. She had recently given birth, which explained her protective response to David. But something had happened to her own cubs. Disease, accident, or predation by other animals. Her maternal instincts, with no outlet, had focused on the helpless human infant she had found. This realization changed everything about the situation. The lioness wasn't simply protecting David out of some mysterious impulse. She was trying to care for him as she would her own young. The problem was that lion's milk and human infant needs were incompatible, and David would not survive much longer without proper nutrition and care. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed insane under any other circumstances. Slowly, deliberately, he began to move closer to the lioness and David, speaking continuously in low, soothing tones. He held the container of sheep's milk extended in front of him, making it clear that he carried something the infant needed. Lioness tensed as he approached, her muscles bunching as if preparing to spring. But she didn't attack. Instead, she watched with what could only be described as desperate intelligence as Marcus knelt at the edge of her protective circle and offered the milk to David. The infant responded immediately to the familiar scent and taste, sucking eagerly at the cloth-soaked milk Marcus offered. His color improved almost instantly, and his crying subsided into the satisfied sounds of a feeding baby. The lioness watched this process with intense interest, seeming to understand that Marcus was providing something she could not. What happened next would remain burned in Marcus's memory forever. The great cat slowly, deliberately, moved aside, making room for him in the shade beside David. She didn't retreat or abandon her charge. Instead, she seemed to be inviting Marcus to join her in caring for the infant. For perhaps 20 minutes, man and mountain lion knelt together in the desert shade, united in their concern for a helpless child. Marcus fed David while the lioness watched, occasionally reaching out with a massive paw to gently touch the infant's arm or leg. Her claws remained sheathed throughout, and her touch was delicate enough that David showed no fear or distress. But as David's immediate needs were met and his condition stabilized, Marcus faced the delicate problem of how to leave with the child without triggering the lioness's protective instincts. She had allowed him to help, but would she permit him to take David away? The answer came when Marcus slowly began to gather the infant into his arms, preparing to carry him back to the other children. The lioness rose as well, padding to the edge of the shade and looking out across the desert in the direction from which Marcus had come. She seemed to understand that David needed to leave, but her posture suggested she intended to accompany them. The journey back to where Copper waited with the other 11 children became one of the most surreal experiences of Marcus's life. He walked carefully down the hillside carrying David, while the mountain lioness padded alongside like some enormous, deadly escort. She maintained a distance of perhaps 10 yards, close enough to intervene if she perceived danger, but far enough to avoid causing panic. When they reached the temporary camp where the other children waited in the shade, Marcus faced a new dilemma. Copper, despite her usual calm temperament, was clearly agitated by the presence of the big cat. The mare's nostrils flared, her ears were pinned back, and she shifted nervously despite her training. The other infants, perhaps sensing the tension, had begun to fuss and cry, but the lioness seemed to understand the situation better than anyone. After circling the camp once, apparently satisfying herself that the children were safe and properly cared for, she approached to within a few feet of where David lay with his siblings. She touched her nose gently to the infant's forehead in what could only be interpreted as a farewell, then turned and padded away toward the hills without looking back. Marcus watched her go with a mixture of relief and something approaching awe. In his 6 years of solitary wandering, he had encountered the desert's dangers and beauties, but never had he witnessed such a demonstration of the mysterious connections that could exist between species when survival was at stake. With David safely recovered and the immediate crisis resolved, Marcus turned his attention back to the larger challenge of getting all 12 children to safety. The morning was advancing rapidly, and the temperature was climbing toward levels that would be dangerous for the infants. He needed to find shelter for the day and plan their route for the following night's travel. But as he began to reorganize their supplies and prepare for the next stage of the journey, a new sound reached his ears, one that brought both hope and anxiety in equal measure. Horses were approaching from the east, moving at a steady lope that suggested urgent purpose rather than casual travel. Marcus positioned himself protectively in front of the children, rifle ready but not immediately threatening. In this remote country, riders could represent help or danger, and with 12 helpless infants to protect, he couldn't afford to take chances. The riders who came into view were unlike anything he had expected. Leading the group was a woman, riding astride rather than side saddle, her long brown hair braided back in a practical style that spoke of frontier experience. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of weathered prettiness that came from life in a harsh country. Her clothes were men's clothing, adapted for her smaller frame: denim pants, cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had seen hard use. Behind her rode 3 men, all armed but with their weapons secured rather than ready for immediate use. Their posture suggested caution rather than aggression, and the woman's position at the front of the group indicated leadership rather than captivity. As they drew closer, Marcus could see details that told a story of recent hardship. The woman's clothes were dusty and torn in places. The men showed signs of exhaustion and stress. Their horses were travel-worn but still strong, suggesting they had been pushing hard to cover distance. The woman reined in about 30 yards away, well outside rifle range but close enough for conversation. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" she called, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. Marcus felt a chill of recognition, though he was certain he had never seen this woman before. "I am," he replied carefully. "Who's asking?" The woman's face broke into an expression of profound relief. "Thank God," she breathed. "We've been looking for you since yesterday morning. I'm Catherine Whitmore, Margaret's daughter. We heard what you've done for our children." Understanding crashed over Marcus like a physical blow. This was one of the survivors of the wagon train attack, part of the group that had been forced to abandon the 12 infants at Devil's Canyon. She had somehow learned of his rescue attempt and had been searching for him across the vast desert. "How did you find us?" Marcus asked, his rifle lowering as the implications of this meeting sank in. Catherine Whitmore smiled, and despite the exhaustion etched in her features, it was a radiant expression. "We followed your trail from the canyon, and when we couldn't track you anymore, we followed the mountain lion tracks. Figured anything that could interest a big cat out here was worth investigating." She dismounted and approached slowly, her hands visible and non-threatening. "Mr. Thompson, I can't begin to express what this means. When we left those babies, we knew we were probably condemning them to death. To learn that someone found them, that they're alive." Her voice broke with emotion. "They're alive," Marcus confirmed, "but they need medical attention. Food, proper shelter, care that I can't provide in the middle of the desert." "We know," Catherine replied. "That's why we're here. We've got wagons waiting 6 miles north of here, medical supplies, wet nurses for the smallest ones, everything we could gather from the settlements between here and Tucson." For the first time since finding the children at Devil's Canyon, Marcus felt the crushing weight of responsibility begin to lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. Help had arrived not in the form of distant authorities or reluctant strangers, but from the very people who had been forced to make the impossible choice in the first place. As Catherine Whitmore knelt beside the children she had helped abandon just days before, as she counted each tiny face and whispered names she had memorized in anguish, Marcus understood that the rescue had entered a new phase. What had begun as one man's desperate attempt to save 12 abandoned infants was becoming something larger, a reunion, a healing, and perhaps most importantly, the beginning of something that looked remarkably like family. The desert stretched endless and hostile around them, but in that moment, surrounded by children who had survived against all odds and adults who had risked everything to find them. The future suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The temporary camp that Catherine Whitmore's rescue party had established 6 miles north of Marcus's position was unlike anything he had expected. Hidden in a natural depression between rolling hills, protected from the worst of the desert wind, and partially shaded by a grove of ancient mesquite trees, it represented a level of organization and preparation that spoke of careful planning. Rather than desperate improvisation, 3 canvas-covered wagons formed the heart of the settlement, their beds loaded with supplies that had clearly been gathered from multiple sources. Marcus could see medical equipment, food stores, clothing, and most importantly for the infant's survival, several large containers that he hoped contained milk. A cook fire burned in a carefully constructed stone circle, tended by an elderly Mexican woman whose weathered hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding large groups under difficult conditions. But it was the people who gave the camp its most remarkable character. Catherine had brought with her not just the 3 armed men who had accompanied her search party, but a collection of individuals whose presence told the story of a community mobilized to right a terrible wrong. Dr. Samuel Harrison stood beside the largest wagon, a man in his 60s whose pristine white shirt and carefully trimmed beard seemed incongruous in the desert setting. He had ridden out from Tucson with a complete medical kit and the kind of determined expression that suggested he would brook no nonsense from anyone who questioned his presence in such a remote location. Beside him worked a woman Marcus estimated to be in her 40s, her movements suggesting medical training as she organized supplies with methodical precision. "That's Dr. Harrison and his assistant, Miss Porter," Catherine explained as they approached the camp with the 12 infants distributed among the rescue party's riders. When word reached Tucson about what had happened to our wagon train and later about your rescue attempt, he insisted on coming personally. Near the cook fire, 2 young women worked with quiet efficiency to prepare what appeared to be feeding bottles and infant formula. Both were clearly nursing mothers themselves, their bodies showing the telltale signs of recent childbirth. One, a blonde woman who couldn't have been more than 20, looked up as they approached, and her face lit with joy at the sight of the rescued children. Mary Beth volunteered to serve as wet nurse, Catherine continued, following Marcus's gaze. So did Elena there beside her. They both lost their own babies to the fever last month and jumped at the chance to help ours survive. The 3rd wagon disgorged 2 more unexpected allies. Reverend Joshua Matthews was a circuit preacher whose territory covered hundreds of miles of frontier settlements. He was a tall, spare man with intense gray eyes and hands that looked more accustomed to wielding tools than Bibles. With him was his wife Sarah, a competent-looking woman whose plain dress and practical demeanor suggested she was no stranger to frontier hardships, but perhaps the most surprising member of the rescue party was a figure Marcus recognized from his cattle-working days. Jake Sullivan was a range boss who commanded respect from Colorado to Mexico, a man whose word carried weight with ranchers, lawmen, and territorial officials alike. His presence here, in a camp dedicated to rescuing abandoned infants, spoke of connections and influence that could prove crucial in the days ahead. Jake heard about our situation from one of his riders who witnessed the wagon train attack, Catherine explained as Sullivan approached to help transfer the children. He's been coordinating the search efforts and organizing support from the surrounding territories. Sullivan was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He handled the infants with surprising gentleness for someone whose reputation had been built on managing dangerous cattle drives and dealing with rustlers. As he carefully lifted little Jonathan from Marcus's chest carrier, he spoke quietly but with absolute conviction. "What you've done out here is something special, Thompson. Don't think there's a man in 3 territories who would have attempted what you pulled off. These children owe you their lives, and their families won't forget it." The process of transferring the children from their improvised carriers to proper care was both joyful and heart-wrenching. Marcus had grown attached to each infant during their desperate journey together, learning their individual personalities and needs through hours of constant attention. Watching them being taken by others, even for their own good, created an unexpected sense of loss. Dr. Harrison immediately began examining each child with thorough professionalism. His preliminary assessments were encouraging. While all showed signs of their ordeal, none appeared to have suffered permanent damage from their days in the desert. The twin girls, who had been Marcus's greatest concern, responded well to proper hydration and the ministrations of the volunteer wet nurses. "Remarkable," the doctor murmured as he completed his examination of David, the infant who had been carried off by the mountain lioness. "No injuries whatsoever, and his vital signs are actually quite strong. Whatever protected this child knew what it was doing." As evening approached, and the desert temperature began its rapid decline, the camp took on the comfortable bustle of a well-organized household. The infants were fed, cleaned, and settled into proper cradles that had been brought specifically for their transport. Medical needs were addressed with supplies and expertise that Marcus could never have provided. Most importantly, the children were warm, safe, and surrounded by adults whose primary concern was their welfare. But it was during the evening meal that Marcus learned the full scope of what had transpired since his rescue of the children. Catherine Whitmore, it turned out, was more than just the daughter of one of the wagon train survivors. She was a teacher in Tucson, unmarried by choice, and possessed of the kind of fierce intelligence and determination that had driven her to organize the entire rescue operation. When Mother and the other women reached Willow Springs, she explained as they shared a simple but nourishing meal of beans and cornbread, they were barely alive. The story they told about abandoning 12 babies in Devil's Canyon spread through the territory like wildfire. Some people were horrified that they would leave children to die. Others understood that they had no choice. Jake Sullivan picked up the narrative, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Word reached Tucson about the same time that reports came in of a lone rider with an unusual cargo heading northeast from the canyon. Traders, prospectors, even some Apache scouts mentioned seeing a cowboy carrying what looked like bundles of blankets that moved and made noise. The scale of the search effort that had been mounted was staggering. Sullivan had coordinated with territorial authorities to organize multiple search parties, covering hundreds of square miles of desert. Riders had been dispatched to every settlement within a week's travel, carrying descriptions of Marcus and his mission. Telegraph messages had gone out to law enforcement and military posts as far away as Santa Fe and El Paso. "The whole territory was looking for you," Catherine added with a smile that mixed admiration with relief. "You became something of a legend, the cowboy who rode into the desert to save 12 abandoned babies. People who had never met you were praying for your success." Dr. Harrison contributed his own perspective on the unprecedented nature of the rescue. "I've practiced medicine on the frontier for 30 years, he said, cleaning his spectacles with characteristic precision. "I've seen men perform remarkable acts of courage and endurance. But attempting to transport 12 infants across 50 miles of desert alone with improvised equipment, it shouldn't have been possible." The conversation that followed revealed the complex web of relationships and motivations that had brought this diverse group together in the middle of nowhere. Catherine had used her connections in Tucson's educational and religious communities to rally support. Sullivan had leveraged his reputation among ranchers and businessmen to secure supplies and funding. Dr. Harrison had volunteered his services despite the risks to his established practice. The wet nurses had offered their help despite their own recent losses, but perhaps most remarkably, word of the rescue attempt had spread far beyond the immediate region. Telegraph messages had been arriving at Tucson from places as distant as Besiches, San Francisco and Chicago, as newspapers picked up the story and readers responded with offers of support. Families who had lost children were sending money to help with the infants' care. Religious organizations were organizing collections. Even federal authorities in Washington had taken notice of the situation. There's talk of congressional recognition. Reverend Matthews mentioned during a lull in the conversation. Possibly a formal commendation for heroism. The territorial governor has already issued a statement praising your actions. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the scope of attention his rescue attempt had generated. In his mind, he had simply done what needed to be done when confronted with children in desperate need. The idea that his actions had captured the imagination of people across the country seemed surreal, but it was Catherine who articulated what many in the group were thinking. What you did represents something important about who we are as Americans, she said, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had thought deeply about the meaning of recent events. In a time when the frontier can seem lawless and brutal, when survival often depends on looking out for yourself first, you chose to risk everything for children who weren't your responsibility. The discussion continued late into the evening, but it was interrupted by a development that changed the entire character of their situation. Jake Sullivan, who had been monitoring the horizon with the alertness of someone accustomed to trouble, stood suddenly and pointed toward the south. "Riders coming," he announced, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Moving fast and not trying to hide their approach. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, a dust cloud marked the progress of what appeared to be a large group of horsemen. Even in the fading light, it was clear that they were heading directly for the camp with purposeful intent. Dr. Harrison immediately began securing his medical supplies while the wet nurses moved protectively closer to the infants. Sullivan and his men checked their weapons and positioned themselves to defend the camp if necessary. But Catherine's reaction was different. She stood, watching the approaching riders with an expression that mixed hope with apprehension. "It might be Mother," she said quietly. "We sent word to Willow Springs about finding you and the children. If she received our message." As the riders drew closer, details became visible that confirmed Catherine's hope. The group consisted of perhaps 15 people, mostly women, riding with the desperate determination of those who had endured unimaginable loss and were now racing toward the possibility of redemption. Leading them was a woman whose bearing and features clearly marked her as Catherine's mother. Margaret Whitmore rode like someone half her age, her gray hair streaming behind her as she pushed her horse toward the camp. Behind her came the other survivors of the wagon train attack, women who had been forced to abandon their children and had lived with that agony every moment since. The reunion that followed defied description. Mothers who had given up their babies for dead fell to their knees beside the improvised cradles, weeping as they touched tiny faces they had never expected to see again. The camp filled with the sounds of joy and relief as families were reunited against all odds. But it was Margaret Whitmore's meeting with Marcus that carried the greatest emotional weight. The woman who had written the desperate note at Devil's Canyon, who had made the impossible choice to leave 12 infants with only hope and prayer for protection, stood before the man who had answered that prayer. "I don't have words," she said simply, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "When we left them, we thought we were choosing how they would die, not giving them a chance to live. What you've done, it's a miracle." Marcus, uncomfortable with praise and attention under the best of circumstances, found himself moved by the raw emotion of the moment. "Any man would have done the same," he replied, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. As the evening progressed and the chaos of reunion began to settle into something resembling normal camp life, Marcus found himself the center of attention in ways that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Mothers pressed gifts on him, small mementos, family heirlooms, promises of lifelong gratitude. Men who had heard his story insisted on shaking his hand and offering him work, land, partnership in business ventures. but it was a conversation with young Mary Beth, one of the volunteer wet nurses, that gave Marcus the deepest insight into how his actions had affected others. She approached him as he stood apart from the celebration, seeking the kind of solitude that had been his companion for 6 years. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you for what you've given me." Marcus looked at her with confusion. "I haven't given you anything, miss. You're the one who volunteered to help nurse these children." Mary Beth smiled, and despite the sadness that shadowed her eyes, it was a genuinely happy expression. "You gave me purpose again. When I lost my baby, I thought my life was over. The milk came in, but there was no child to feed. I felt like God was mocking me, giving me what I needed to be a mother, but taking away my child." She gestured toward the cradles where the infants slept peacefully. "But now I understand. Maybe I lost my baby so I could help save these 12. Maybe everything that happened was meant to bring us all to this moment." Her words stayed with Marcus long after the camp had settled into the quiet rhythms of night. As he lay in his bedroll, listening to the soft sounds of sleeping children and their grateful guardians, he found himself contemplating the strange turns that had brought him to this place. 6 years ago, the loss of his wife and son had driven him into the wilderness, seeking solitude and escape from the pain of human connection. Now, through a series of events that seemed guided by something beyond mere chance, he had become the instrument of salvation for 12 other children. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to escape from family and responsibility, he had found the greatest responsibility of all. But as dawn approached and the camp began to stir with preparations for the final journey to safety, Marcus realized that something fundamental had changed within him. The hollow ache that had been his constant companion since Catherine's death had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The rescue was nearly complete. The children would soon be in the safety of established settlements, surrounded by people who could provide everything they needed to grow and thrive. His part in their story was ending, and soon he would face the choice of returning to his solitary wandering or finding a new path forward. As he helped load the wagons for departure, Marcus caught sight of little David, the infant who had been carried off by the mountain lioness and found again through what could only be called a miracle. The child was alert and healthy, showing no ill effects from his extraordinary adventure. When Marcus approached, David's face lit with recognition, and his tiny hand reached out as if seeking the familiar touch that had sustained him through the darkest hours. In that moment, Marcus understood that whatever path lay ahead, it would not be the same solitary trail he had ridden for 6 years. The children had changed him as much as he had saved them, and there would be no going back to the man he had been before he heard their cries echoing through Devil's Canyon. The final stage of their journey was about to begin, but Marcus sensed that for him, it represented not an ending but a beginning, the start of a new chapter in a life that had found its way back to hope. The wagon train's arrival in Willow Springs 3 days later marked the beginning of complications that none of them had anticipated. What should have been a triumphant conclusion to an extraordinary rescue became the opening chapter of a legal and social battle that would test everything Marcus thought he understood about justice, family, and the price of heroism. Willow Springs was a frontier settlement of perhaps 300 souls, built around a reliable water source that made it a crucial stop for travelers crossing the territorial Badlands. The town consisted of a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, boarding house, church, and the territorial courthouse that would soon become the center of their troubles. Surrounding these establishments were scattered homes and businesses that served the ranchers, miners, and travelers who comprised the region's population. Word of their approach had preceded them, carried by riders who had witnessed the remarkable procession of wagons filled with rescued infants and their grateful families. By the time they reached the town's outskirts, A crowd had gathered that included not just curious locals, but also individuals, whose presence suggested that news of the rescue had attracted attention from far beyond the immediate region. Marcus recognized the type immediately. Territorial officials, federal marshals, newspaper correspondents, and the kind of Eastern lawyers who appeared wherever there was money or publicity to be gained. Their presence transformed what should have been a celebration into something that felt uncomfortably like a public spectacle. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Standing on the courthouse steps, flanked by two men in expensive suits, was a woman Marcus had never seen before. She appeared to be in her 50s, well-dressed in the fashion of Eastern cities, with the kind of bearing that spoke of education and social position. When she stepped forward as their wagons came to a halt, her expression was stern and purposeful. "I am Mrs. Abigail Thornton," she announced in a voice trained to command attention. "I represent the Territorial Child Welfare Agency, recently established by order of the Territorial Legislature. I'm here to investigate the circumstances surrounding these children and to ensure their proper placement in appropriate homes." Margaret Whitmore climbed down from the lead wagon with the careful dignity of someone who had endured too much to be easily intimidated. "Mrs. Thornton," she replied with icy courtesy, "these children have families. They're with their mothers." Right now, Mrs. Thornton's smile was cold and professional. "That, Mrs. Whitmore, is precisely what we're here to determine. The abandonment of 12 infants in the desert, regardless of the circumstances, constitutes a serious violation of territorial law regarding child welfare. Until a proper investigation can be conducted, these children will be placed in protective custody." The crowd that had gathered to witness what they expected to be a joyous reunion fell silent as the implications of Mrs. Thornton's words sank. Catherine Whitmore stepped forward, her teacher's instincts for confronting authority evident in her posture. "On what legal basis are you asserting jurisdiction over these children?" she demanded. "They're with their natural mothers, they're healthy and well cared for, and they've committed no crime." One of the men in expensive suits stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio with theatrical precision. "Miss Whitmore, I am Attorney Harrison Blackwood, retained by the Territorial Child Welfare Agency. The legal basis is quite clear. Territorial Statute 47B regarding the abandonment of dependent children. Any child found to have been abandoned by their guardians becomes a ward of the territory until proper hearings can determine their best interests." Jake Sullivan, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, moved to stand beside the Whitmore women. His reputation in the territory carried weight that even Eastern lawyers had to respect. "Blackwood," he said in the deceptively quiet tone that experienced men recognized as dangerous, "these women didn't abandon their children. They were attacked by bandits, their men were killed, and they made the only choice that gave their babies any chance of survival. If you want to prosecute someone for child abandonment, maybe you should start with the outlaws who created the situation." Blackwood's response was smooth and unimpressed. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your emotional investment in this situation, but the law is clear. Circumstances don't alter the legal definition of abandonment. These children were left unattended in a hostile environment, and only luck prevented their deaths." It was Dr. Harrison who introduced the next complication, his medical authority, lending weight to concerns that Marcus was only beginning to understand. "There's also the matter of the children's health and development," the doctor said reluctantly. "While Mr. Thompson's rescue was heroic, the conditions these infants endured have left them vulnerable to various complications. They require extended medical supervision to ensure their proper recovery." Mrs. Thornton seized on this medical opinion with obvious satisfaction. "Exactly, doctor. Which is why the Territorial Child Welfare Agency has arranged for these children to be placed in the Blessed Angels Foundling Home in Phoenix, where they can receive proper medical care and education until permanent placements can be arranged." The mention of the foundling home sent a chill through the gathered mothers that was almost visible. Margaret Whitmore's face went white, and several of the other women began to weep openly. Marcus didn't understand the specific source of their fear, but Catherine's reaction made it clear that the Blessed Angels' foundling home represented something worse than simple separation. "That place is a death sentence," Catherine said flatly. "Half the children who go there don't survive their first year. The rest are farmed out as unpaid labor to anyone willing to pay the adoption fees. You're not talking about child welfare, you're talking about trafficking." Blackwood's expression hardened at the accusation. "Miss Whitmore, I'll caution you against making slanderous statements about a legally recognized charitable institution. The Blessed Angels Foundling Home has been providing care for abandoned and orphaned children for 5 years with full territorial approval. It was Reverend Matthews who provided the missing context that explained the true nature of what they were facing." The circuit preacher had remained silent during the initial confrontation, but now he stepped forward with the moral authority that his position carried even in frontier communities. "Mrs. Thornton," he said in the measured tone he used for his most serious sermons, "I've conducted funerals for 17 children who died at Blessed Angels in the past 2 years. I've also married off girls as young as 14 to men who adopted them from that institution for purposes that had nothing to do with charity. If you place these children there, you'll be condemning them to fates worse than what they faced in the desert." The crowd's mood was shifting, becoming hostile to the Eastern officials who had arrived to separate families that had just been reunited. But Mrs. Thornton and her lawyers seemed prepared for resistance, and their response suggested they had more authority than their modest numbers might indicate. "Reverend Matthews," Mrs. Thornton replied with bureaucratic precision, "you're emotional. Concerns are noted, but they don't alter the legal requirements of the situation. These children have been traumatized by abandonment and exposure. They require professional evaluation to determine whether their natural families are capable of providing appropriate care." It was then that Marcus began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't simply a bureaucratic investigation triggered by unusual circumstances. The rescue of 12 abandoned infants had attracted attention from people who saw opportunity in tragedy, who viewed vulnerable children as commodities to be processed through a system that prioritized control over welfare. The immediate crisis came when Mrs. Thornton's assistants moved toward the wagons where the infants lay sleeping, clearly intending to take physical custody of the children. The response from the mothers was immediate and fierce. Margaret Whitmore placed herself bodily between the officials and her grandchildren, while the other women formed a protective circle around the wagons. "You'll have to go through us," Margaret declared with quiet intensity. "We didn't survive bandit attacks and desert crossings to hand our children over to bureaucrats who've never missed a meal or spent a night wondering if their babies would see morning." The confrontation might have escalated into violence if not for the intervention of an unexpected ally. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a local lawman whose jurisdiction technically included authority over child welfare matters within his county. He was a weathered man in his 40s, someone who had earned respect through years of fair dealing with the various factions that made frontier life complicated. "Mrs. Thornton," he said as he approached the tense gathering, "I've been reviewing the relevant statutes, and I'm afraid there are some procedural issues we need to address before any children can be removed from their families." Blackwood turned to face this new challenge with obvious irritation. "Sheriff Bradley, the territorial authority supersedes local jurisdiction in matters of child welfare. We have full legal standing to take custody of abandoned children pending proper hearings." Bradley's smile was thin but confident. "That's where you're wrong, counselor. The territorial statute you're citing requires that children be currently abandoned to trigger agency intervention. These children aren't abandoned, they're with their natural families. The fact that they were temporarily separated due to extraordinary circumstances doesn't establish a pattern of abandonment that would justify removal." The legal argument that followed revealed the complexity of applying territorial law to situations that its authors had never envisioned. Bradley had clearly done his homework, consulting with other legal authorities and preparing for exactly this confrontation. His arguments were technically sound and practically reasonable, but they were met with increasingly desperate responses from the child welfare officials. It became clear that Mrs. Thornton and her associates were operating under pressure from higher authorities who had their own reasons for wanting control over the rescued children. The newspaper attention that the rescue had generated was creating political opportunities that various factions wanted to exploit, and the children had become pawns in a larger game that had nothing to do with their welfare. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harrison, who had been quietly examining the children throughout the legal arguments, announced findings that undermined the entire basis for agency intervention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in the authoritative tone that his medical degree carried, "I've completed comprehensive examinations of all 12 children. While they show evidence of their ordeal, none are suffering from conditions that require institutional care. With proper nutrition and normal family attention, they should recover completely within a matter of weeks." More importantly, the doctor had discovered something that changed the entire legal landscape of the situation. "Furthermore," he continued, "my examinations reveal that 3 of these children show clear signs of having been well nourished and carefully tended even before their rescue. They were not abandoned in the legal sense. They were temporarily separated from caregivers who continued to provide for their needs, even under desperate circumstances." The evidence Dr. Harrison presented was devastating to the agency's case. Medical records, growth patterns, and physical condition all supported the conclusion that the children had been loved and cared for by their families, that their temporary abandonment had been a desperate expedient rather than neglect or abuse. But it was Marcus who provided the final piece of evidence that resolved the crisis. During the hours of legal argument, he had remained largely silent, overwhelmed by the complexity of issues he didn't fully understand. But when Mrs. Thornton made one final attempt to assert agency authority, Marcus stepped forward with a simple statement that cut through all the legal maneuvering. "These aren't abandoned children," he said quietly. "I found them at Devil's Canyon with a note from their mothers explaining exactly why they had to leave them there. The women who left them risked their own lives trying to reach help, and they came back as soon as they could. That's not abandonment. That's love making impossible choices." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the original note that Margaret Whitmore had left with the children, the piece of paper that had explained their desperate situation and begged for Christian mercy. As he read the note aloud to the gathered crowd, its raw honesty and obvious love for the children it concerned made the agency's arguments seem callous and bureaucratic. The crowd's reaction was immediate and decisive. These were frontier people who understood desperate choices and the courage required to make them. They had no sympathy for Eastern officials who wanted to punish families for surviving against impossible odds. Sheriff Bradley used the moment to assert his authority definitively. "Mrs. Thornton, based on the evidence presented and my authority as the ranking law enforcement officer in this county, I'm ruling that these children will remain with their families pending any formal hearings that may be required. If the territorial government wants to challenge that decision, they can take it up with the federal courts." The defeat of the Child Welfare Agency's intervention marked a turning point not just in the immediate crisis but in Marcus's understanding of his own role in events that had spiraled far beyond anything he had anticipated. What had begun as a simple act of rescue had become a catalyst for examining larger questions about family, authority, and the rights of individuals against institutional power. But even as the immediate legal threat receded, Marcus found himself facing personal challenges that were in some ways more difficult than anything he had encountered in the desert. The children he had risked everything to save were safe with their families, But his part in their rescue had made him a public figure in ways that conflicted with everything he understood about himself. Newspaper correspondents sought interviews. Territorial officials offered him positions and honors, and well-meaning citizens pressed invitations and opportunities on him that assumed he wanted recognition for his actions. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent 6 years in deliberate solitude, and Marcus found himself longing for the simplicity of the trail. It was Catherine Whitmore who recognized his distress and provided the perspective that helped him navigate the unexpected consequences of heroism. Finding him alone behind the livery stable where he had gone to escape the crowd's attention, she approached with the directness that he had come to associate with her character. "The hardest part isn't the rescue," she said without preamble. "It's figuring out what comes next when everyone expects you to be someone you never intended to be." Marcus looked at her with surprise and recognition. Here was someone who understood the burden of unwanted attention, the pressure of living up to other people's expectations of heroism. "I just did what needed doing," he said, echoing words he had spoken before, but which seemed insufficient to address the complexity of his current situation. Catherine smiled with the kind of understanding that came from her own experience with public expectations. "And that's exactly why what you did matters so much. In a world where people often do only what benefits them directly, you chose to risk everything for children who weren't your responsibility. That's not just heroism, it's character." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of little David, now healthy and alert, carried by his mother, but reaching toward Marcus with the recognition that had developed during their desperate journey together. As Marcus took the infant into his arms, feeling the familiar weight and warmth that had sustained them both through the darkest hours, he began to understand that the bonds formed in crisis couldn't be easily dissolved by the return to normal life. The children had changed him as much as he had saved them, and whatever path lay ahead would be shaped by that transformation. The solitary cowboy who had ridden into Devil's Canyon no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had discovered that connection to others, rather than being a source of pain to be avoided, could be the foundation for a life of meaning and purpose. As evening settled over Willow Springs and the crowd finally dispersed, leaving the reunited families to plan their futures in peace, Marcus faced the most important decision of his adult life. He could return to the trail, resume the wandering existence that had been his refuge from human connection, and allow the rescue to become simply an extraordinary episode in an otherwise solitary life. Or he could choose a different path, one that acknowledged the bonds that had been forged in crisis and built upon them to create something that had seemed impossible just days before. A family born not of blood, but of shared struggle and mutual salvation. The choice, like all the most important decisions in life, would define not just his future, but the kind of man he chose to become. 6 months after the rescue at Devil's Canyon, Marcus Thompson stood on the porch of a house he had never imagined owning, watching 12 children play in a yard that had become the heart of something unprecedented in the Arizona territory. The dwelling itself was a testament to what could be accomplished when an entire community united behind a common purpose. A large, sturdy structure built with donated materials and volunteer labor, designed specifically to accommodate the unique family that had emerged from the desert crisis. The house sat on a rise overlooking the Verde River Valley, positioned to catch the cooling breezes that made even summer afternoons bearable. Its design reflected both practicality and hope. Spacious rooms that could accommodate growing children, a large kitchen equipped to feed a small army, and most importantly, wide porches that served as outdoor living spaces where the extended family could gather during the long, warm evenings that characterized this part of the territory. But it was the yard that truly told the story of how much had changed since that desperate night in Devil's Canyon. A vegetable garden, tended by Catherine Whitmore with the same methodical precision she had once brought to teaching, provided fresh food for the growing children. Fruit trees, planted with optimistic faith in the future, were already showing signs of the bounty they would eventually provide. A playground area, constructed by Jake Sullivan and other volunteers, echoed with the laughter of children who had once faced death in the desert, but now faced only the normal challenges of childhood. Transformation had not happened overnight, nor had it been without complications and setbacks. In the months following the legal victory at Willow Springs, the families affected by the wagon train attack had faced difficult decisions about their futures. Some had chosen to return to the eastern territories they had originally left, seeking safety and familiarity over the uncertainties of frontier life. Others had decided to remain in Arizona but to settle in established towns, where institutional support was available for raising their children. But a core group, led by Margaret and Catherine Whitmore, had made a different choice. They had decided to create something new, an intentional community, centered around the children who had been saved and the man who had saved them. It was an arrangement that defied conventional social structures, but which seemed to work with a harmony that surprised even its participants. Marcus had resisted the idea initially, his instincts still pulling him toward the solitary life that had been his refuge for so many years. But the bonds forged during those desperate days had proven stronger than his inclination toward isolation. More importantly, he had discovered that the children he had rescued continued to need him in ways that went beyond their original physical salvation. Little David, now a sturdy toddler whose early adventures with the mountain lioness had left him fearless around animals, still sought Marcus out for comfort during thunderstorms or when unfamiliar visitors appeared. The twin girls, Emily and Grace, had developed the uncanny ability to sense Marcus's moods and would toddle over to offer wordless comfort when his memories grew too painful. Jonathan, whose cough had once threatened his life, had grown into a robust boy whose favorite activity was following Marcus around the property, absorbing lessons about horses, tools, and the practical skills needed for frontier survival. But it was his relationship with Rebecca, the red-haired infant who had smiled at him during those first desperate days, that most clearly illustrated how much his life had changed. Now almost a year old, she had appointed herself as Marcus's particular responsibility, crying when separated from him for too long and showing a determination to be involved in whatever work he was doing around the property. She's going to be a handful when she's older, Catherine observed, joining Marcus on the porch as the afternoon light began to slant toward evening. She carried a pitcher of cool water and 2 glasses, the kind of thoughtful gesture that had become routine in their unconventional household. Marcus accepted the water gratefully, noting how Catherine had adapted to frontier life with the same competence she had once brought to her classroom in Tucson. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, now bore the calluses that came from gardening, cooking, and the countless tasks required to maintain a household of this size. Her complexion had been touched by sun and wind, giving her the healthy appearance of someone who spent her days in productive outdoor labor. "They're all going to be handfuls," Marcus replied, watching as 8-year-old Samuel attempted to teach the younger children how to stack rocks into a stable tower. "Growing up out here with this much freedom and space, they're going to be different from children raised in towns or cities." Catherine settled into the chair beside him, the easy companionship between them speaking of shared work and mutual respect that had developed over months of building something together. Their relationship had evolved naturally from the crisis, circumstances of the rescue into something deeper and more complex, though both had been careful not to define it in ways that might threaten the delicate balance of their extended family. "Different how?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on child development in frontier conditions. Marcus considered the question, watching as little Jonathan attempted to saddle a patient goat while Rebecca cheered his efforts from her position of safety behind a fence post. "Independent," he said finally. "Self-reliant in ways that children raised with more protection might not be. But also," he paused, searching for the right words, connected to each other in ways that go beyond normal sibling bonds. They've been through something extraordinary together, and that's going to shape how they see the world. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Harrison, whose regular visits to check on the children's health had become social occasions that the entire household anticipated. The elderly physician had become something of an unofficial grandfather to the rescued children, bringing not just medical expertise but stories, candy, and the kind of gentle wisdom that came from a lifetime of caring for frontier families. "Marcus, Catherine," he greeted them as he climbed down from his buggy with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years. "How are our young pioneers today?" The examination that followed had become a cherished ritual. Dr. Harrison checked each child with thorough professionalism, but the medical assessments were interspersed with games, jokes, and individual attention that made the children eagerly anticipate his visits. His pronouncements on their health had become progressively more optimistic over the months, documenting not just physical recovery, but the kind of robust development that spoke of children who were loved, well-fed, and secure in their environment. "Remarkable," he announced after completing his rounds, accepting the coffee that Margaret Whitmore had prepared with the precision of someone who had been managing large households for decades. "Every one of them is not just healthy but thriving. Weight gains are excellent, developmental milestones are being met on schedule, and most importantly, they show none of the psychological trauma that often affects children who have experienced severe stress." The doctor's observation raised a topic that had been on Marcus's mind increasingly as the children grew and began to ask questions about their early experiences. How much should they be told about their abandonment and rescue? How could the adults in their lives help them understand their history without traumatizing them with knowledge of how close they had come to death? "They're going to want answers eventually," Marcus said, voicing concerns that he had discussed with Catherine and the other adults but never resolved to his satisfaction. "David already asks questions about why he's different from the other children, why he doesn't have a father like some of his friends in town." Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully, his medical training having given him extensive experience with families dealing with traumatic histories. "The key is age-appropriate honesty," he advised. "Children can handle much more truth than adults often assume, as long as it's presented in contexts that emphasize love and protection rather than abandonment and danger." Margaret Whitmore, who had been listening to this conversation while managing the practical tasks of feeding and settling 12 children for the evening, offered her own perspective on the challenges they faced. At 62, she had become the unofficial matriarch of their unconventional family, her experience raising her own children in difficult circumstances making her the natural authority on questions of child-rearing. "What they need to understand," she said, with the quiet conviction that had sustained her through the loss of her husband and the desperate journey that followed, "is that they were never unwanted. Every decision that was made, leaving them at the canyon, Marcus finding them, all of us coming together here, was made out of love and the determination to give them the best possible future." As evening deepened and the children were gradually gathered for baths, dinner, and bedtime stories, Marcus found himself reflecting on how completely his life had been transformed by that fateful ride through Devil's Canyon. The solitary cowboy, who had sought isolation from human connection, had become the central figure in a family structure that defied conventional definitions, but which worked with remarkable harmony. The evening routine that had developed over the months was a testament to the organizational skills of the women who had taken on the challenge of raising 12 children together. Catherine coordinated baths and bedtime preparations with the efficiency of someone who had managed classrooms full of energetic students. Margaret oversaw the kitchen and meal planning with the wisdom of decades of experience, feeding large families on limited resources. Mary Beth and Elena, the volunteer wet nurses who had stayed on as permanent members of the household, manage the medical needs and developmental activities that kept the children healthy and engaged. But it was Marcus who had become the primary disciplinarian and male role model for the children, a responsibility that had required him to develop skills and perspectives he had never imagined needing. Teaching children to ride horses safely, to use tools without injury, to understand the difference between acceptable risk and dangerous recklessness. These had become daily challenges that tested his patience and creativity in ways that managing cattle had never done. "Uncle Marcus," Rebecca called from her position at the dinner table, using the title that all the children had adopted for him. "Will you tell us the story about the mountain lion again?" The request had become a nightly ritual, though the story that Marcus told bore little resemblance to the terrifying reality of tracking a predator through desert hills while fearing for David's life. In his version, the mountain lion was a protector who had kept David safe until help could arrive, a guardian spirit of the desert who understood that children needed special care. As he told the familiar story, Marcus caught Catherine's eye across the table and saw in her expression the same mixture of amusement and affection that had characterized their relationship as it deepened beyond friendship into something more complex and meaningful. They had not formally discussed their feelings for each other, but the practical intimacy of shared child rearing and household management had created bonds that went far beyond mere partnership. After the children were settled for the night, the adults gathered on the porch for the quiet conversations that had become their primary opportunity for adult companionship. These evening discussions ranged from practical matters, crop rotation, water rights, the children's educational needs, to deeper questions about their unusual family structure and its long-term sustainability. "We've received another inquiry from that newspaper in San Francisco," Catherine mentioned as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. "They want to do a follow-up story about how the children are developing, what our family structure looks like now." Marcus felt the familiar uneasiness that still accompanied any mention of media attention. The initial newspaper coverage of the rescue had brought both welcome support and unwanted scrutiny, creating publicity that had attracted everything from generous donations to marriage proposals from women who had never met him, but who were inspired by romanticized accounts of his heroism. "What did you tell them?" he asked, hoping the answer would be a polite refusal. "That we're a private family living quietly, and we prefer to keep it that way," Catherine replied with the firmness that had helped her manage classroom discipline and legal challenges with equal effectiveness. "The children deserve to grow up without being treated as curiosities or symbols." Dr. Harrison, who had been quietly smoking his pipe while listening to their conversation, offered a perspective that reflected his years of experience with frontier families. "You've created something remarkable here," he said thoughtfully. "Not just the rescue, but what you've built afterward. This kind of intentional community, centered around children's welfare, could serve as a model for other regions dealing with similar challenges." The comments sparked a discussion that continued late into the evening, touching on subjects that none of them had anticipated when they first came together in crisis. Their unconventional family had attracted attention from social reformers, religious organizations, and territorial officials who saw in their success a possible solution to broader problems of child welfare and community development. But it was Jake Sullivan's visit the following week that brought news that would force them to confront questions about their future that they had been avoiding. The range boss arrived with information that the territorial legislature was considering legislation that would formalize support for frontier families, communities organized around child welfare and mutual support rather than traditional blood relationships. There's talk of land grants, tax advantages, even territorial funding for education and medical care, Sullivan explained as they gathered around the kitchen table for the kind of serious discussion that their situation periodically required. But it would mean accepting formal recognition as an experimental social program with all the oversight and scrutiny that would involve. The debate that followed revealed the tensions that existed beneath the surface harmony of their unusual arrangement. Some members of the household welcomed the possibility of official support and recognition, seeing it as validation of their choices and protection against future legal challenges. Others worried that government involvement would compromise their independence and subject them to bureaucratic interference in decisions that they had been making successfully on their own. Marcus found himself torn between his instinctive distrust of official attention and his recognition that the children's long-term welfare might benefit from institutional support. The practical challenges of educating 12 children, providing medical care, and ensuring their economic security as they grew into adulthood were daunting for any family, even one with the resources and community support they had managed to accumulate. "What do the children think?" Catherine asked, raising a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. "They're old enough to have opinions about whether they want to be part of some territorial social experiment." The conversation that followed, conducted over several evenings with input from all the adults and age-appropriate consultation with the older children, revealed the complexity of decisions that affected not just immediate welfare, but the entire future direction of their family. Some of the children, particularly David and Samuel, who were old enough to understand the implications, expressed enthusiasm for the possibility of formal recognition and support. They had internalized pride in their survival and their unusual family structure, and they welcomed the idea that their experience might help other children in similar circumstances. But others, especially Rebecca and Jonathan, who had developed particularly strong attachments to their current life, showed anxiety about any changes that might disrupt the stability they had found. Their responses reminded the adults that while their rescue had been extraordinary, what the children valued most was the ordinary security of knowing they were loved and would be cared for. The decision, when it finally came, reflected the democratic principles that had guided their household decisions from the beginning. After weeks of discussion, debate, and careful consideration of all perspectives, they chose to accept limited territorial recognition in exchange for educational support and medical funding, while maintaining their independence in matters of daily family management. But the most significant development during this period was personal rather than political. As autumn arrived and the anniversary of the rescue approached, Marcus and Catherine found themselves confronting feelings that had been growing steadily, but which neither had been willing to acknowledge openly. Their relationship had evolved gradually from mutual respect to deep friendship, to something that resembled partnership in all but name. They shared responsibility for the children's welfare, made household decisions together, and had developed the kind of practical intimacy that comes from working toward common goals under challenging circumstances. It was Rebecca who forced the issue with the innocent directness that characterized children's approach to adult relationships they didn't understand. "Why don't you and Aunt Catherine get married like Mama Margaret and Papa Sullivan?" she asked during one of their evening story sessions, referring to the romantic relationship that had developed between the 62-year-old matriarch and the practical range boss who had become a frequent visitor to their household. The question, asked in front of all 12 children and several other adults, created one of those moments of absolute silence that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment, while Catherine looked everywhere except directly at him. But it was little David who provided the perspective that cut through adult hesitation and uncertainty. "Are you scared?" he asked Marcus with the serious concern of someone who remembered being carried through the desert and understood that courage sometimes meant doing difficult things. The simple question from the child he had risked everything to save broke through Marcus's carefully constructed defenses against emotional vulnerability. Looking around the room at faces that had become more precious to him than his own life, he realized that fear of loss had been keeping him from acknowledging what everyone else could see clearly. "Yes," he admitted, speaking as much to Catherine as to the children. I'm scared of caring so much that losing it would break me again." Catherine's response, when it came, was delivered with the same directness that had characterized her approach to every challenge they had faced together. "Then don't lose it," she said simply. "Choose to build something strong enough to last." The wedding that took place on the first anniversary of the rescue was unlike anything the Arizona Territory had seen before. Held in the yard of their unconventional home, presided over by Reverend Matthews, whose circuit riding had brought him back for the occasion, it was attended by representatives from across the territorial community who had followed their story with interest and admiration. But the true significance of the ceremony was not in its public recognition of their relationship, but in what it represented about the possibility of building families and communities based on choice rather than accident, on love rather than obligation, on shared values rather than conventional expectations. As Marcus and Catherine exchanged vows that emphasized partnership in child rearing and mutual support in facing whatever challenges the future might bring, they were surrounded by 12 children whose lives had been saved by individual courage, but who were being raised by community commitment. The guests included frontier families, territorial officials, and even some of the newspaper correspondents who had covered their story. But the real witnesses were the children who had made this extended family possible. Dr. Harrison, now approaching 70, but still making his regular rounds to check on his grandchildren, delivered a toast that captured the significance of what they had accomplished. A year ago, 12 babies were abandoned in the desert, their survival dependent on the slim chance that someone would hear their cries and have the courage to act, he said, raising his glass to the assembled company. Today, those same children are surrounded by parents who chose them, by a community that supports them, and by a future that looks brighter than anyone could have imagined during those dark days at Devil's Canyon. As the evening progressed and the celebration continued under a canopy of desert stars, Marcus found himself holding Rebecca while she slept, her small body relaxed in the complete trust that characterized children who had never known insecurity. Around him, the other children played and laughed with the kind of uninhibited joy that spoke of lives lived without fear or uncertainty about their place in the world. The mountain lioness that had protected David during those terrifying hours had not been seen again, though Marcus occasionally found tracks near their water source that suggested she remained in the area. He chose to believe that she was thriving, perhaps with cubs of her own, and that her brief role as guardian had been part of a larger design that connected all living things in ways that transcended human understanding. The desert that had once seemed like an enemy, a hostile environment that threatened everything vulnerable and precious, had become their home in the truest sense. The children who had been born into crisis and saved by extraordinary circumstances were growing up with the kind of confidence and capability that came from understanding that survival was possible, that communities could be built by choice, and that families were defined by love rather than blood. As the celebration wound down and the children were gradually settled for sleep, Marcus walked the perimeter of their property with the protective instincts that had become second nature. The night sounds of the desert, owls calling, coyotes singing in the distance, the whisper of wind through drought-resistant plants, no longer seemed threatening but familiar, the soundtrack of a place where 12 babies had been given a second chance at life and where a solitary man had discovered that isolation was not the only response to loss. Looking up at the stars that had guided them through that desperate journey a year ago, Marcus felt a peace that he had thought was lost forever. When fever claimed his first family, the children sleeping safely in the house behind him were not replacements for what he had lost, but additions to what he had gained, proof that life could grow from tragedy, that hope could emerge from despair, and that families could be forged in the crucible of shared survival. The rescue that had begun with one man hearing cries in the wilderness had become something larger and more lasting, a demonstration that individual courage could catalyze community action, that children could thrive in unconventional families, And that love was indeed the foundation upon which all meaningful human connection was built. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as tomorrow always did in frontier life. But tonight, surrounded by the children whose lives had been saved and the woman who had chosen to share the future they were building together, Marcus Thompson was home in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the bonds that connect human hearts across the vast emptiness of the world. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs that tested the strength of the bonds forged in crisis. When little Rebecca turned 5, she asked Marcus to teach her to track animals the way he had tracked her through the desert when she was lost. Her request sparked the creation of what became known throughout the territory as the Desert Skills School, an informal education program where Marcus taught not just his own children, but others from neighboring settlements, the practical knowledge needed to survive and thrive in harsh country. Samuel, the boy who had suffered from colic during that first desperate night of travel, grew into a natural leader among the children. By age 10, he had organized his younger siblings into work crews that maintained the garden, cared for the animals, and helped with household tasks. His organizational abilities reminded Catherine of her best students, but his deep understanding of cooperation and mutual support came from experiences no classroom could have provided. The twin girls, Emily and Grace, developed an almost mystical connection to the desert environment that surrounded their home. They could predict weather changes days in advance, find water sources in seemingly barren landscape, and navigate by stars with an accuracy that amazed even Marcus. Their abilities became legendary among the Apache bands that occasionally traded at nearby settlements, who spoke of the white children who understood the old ways. Jonathan, whose respiratory illness had nearly claimed his life during the rescue, became fascinated with Dr. Harrison's medical work and began accompanying the elderly physician on his rounds to other frontier families. His early experiences with illness and recovery gave him an intuitive understanding of healing that complemented formal medical training. By age 12, he was already being called upon to assist with difficult cases, particularly those involving children who had experienced trauma. David, the child who had been protected by the mountain lioness, retained a special connection with wild animals that bordered on the supernatural. Injured creatures seemed to seek him out, somehow understanding that he offered sanctuary rather than threat. The area around their home became known as a place where wounded animals could find healing, and David's reputation as a healer of both domestic and wild creatures spread throughout the region. The other children each developed their own unique gifts and interests, shaped by their extraordinary beginning but not limited by it. Some showed aptitude for learning that rivaled any Eastern Academy student. Others displayed practical skills that made them valuable contributors to frontier communities. All carried themselves with the confidence of children who knew they were loved unconditionally and had survived challenges that would have broken many adults. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how their story began to attract other families facing similar crises. Word spread through informal networks that connected frontier settlements about the unusual household that had proven children could thrive in non-traditional family structures. Single mothers, widowed fathers, and couples struggling with infertility began to seek them out, not as curiosities but as proof that family could be defined by commitment rather than blood. The first addition to their household came 3 years after the rescue, when a traveling preacher brought them news of a situation that eerily echoed their own origins. A family traveling to California had been attacked by bandits near the Colorado River. The parents and older children had been killed, but 2 infant survivors, a boy and girl who appeared to be twins, had been found by Apache scouts and brought to the nearest mission. The church officials, overwhelmed by caring for children they didn't understand and lacking resources for proper infant care, had sent desperate appeals for help throughout the territory. When word reached Catherine and Marcus about the situation, the decision to travel to retrieve the children was unanimous among both adults and the older children who remembered their own rescue. The journey to collect Maria and Carlos' names, given to them by the mission priests, became a family expedition that demonstrated how much their household had evolved from its crisis origins. 12 children, now ranging in age from 4 to 8, traveled with their parents in wagons equipped for extended camping. The logistics of moving such a large group across difficult terrain required planning and cooperation that would have challenged military expeditions, but the children approached it as an adventure that tested skills they had been developing throughout their lives. The mission where the twins had been placed was a stark adobe structure surrounded by irrigated fields that supported a small community of priests and converted Indians. The conditions were basic but clean, and the religious community had clearly done their best to care for the infant survivors. But the relief on the priests' faces when Marcus and Catherine arrived with their extensive family was unmistakable. "We prayed for a miracle," Father Miguel explained as he watched the children expertly set up camp in the mission courtyard. "These babies needed more than we could provide, but we had nowhere to send them. When your message arrived, it seemed like divine intervention." The integration of Maria and Carlos into their family proceeded with remarkable smoothness, perhaps because the children who welcomed them understood from personal experience what it meant to be displaced and in need of sanctuary. Rebecca immediately appointed herself as their primary protector, while Samuel organized the older children into a care rotation that ensured the twins were never left unattended. But it was David's reaction to the new arrivals that most clearly illustrated how their experiences had shaped his character. Watching the infant twins cry from hunger and distress, he approached Marcus with a question that revealed the depth of his understanding about their family's origins. "Were we like that when you found us?" he asked quietly. "Scared and alone and not knowing if anyone cared?" Marcus knelt to bring himself to eye level with the serious 8-year-old, seeing in David's features the baby he had carried through the desert while fearing for both their lives. "Yes," he said honestly, "you were exactly like that. And someone did care enough to risk everything to make sure you were safe." David nodded solemnly, then turned to watch Rebecca gently rocking little Maria while singing the same lullabies that had comforted them all during their early years in the desert household. "Now we get to be the ones who care," he observed with satisfaction that spoke of a child who understood his place in a larger story of rescue and responsibility. The expansion of their family to include Maria and Carlos established a pattern that would continue throughout the following years. Their household became known throughout the southwestern territories as a place where displaced children could find not just temporary shelter but permanent family. The territorial legislature, initially skeptical of their unconventional arrangement, began referring difficult child welfare cases to them with increasing frequency. Each edition brought new challenges and new gifts to their community. Anna, a 7-year-old whose parents had died in a flash flood, brought with her a talent for music that transformed their evening gatherings. She taught the other children songs in 3 languages and helped them create musical performances that became legendary at territorial gatherings. Thomas and Matthew, brothers aged 5 and 3 whose wagon train had been decimated by cholera, carried with them knowledge of Eastern agricultural techniques that revolutionized their farming operations. Their experience with crop rotation and soil conservation methods dramatically increased their food production and made their farm a model that other settlements sought to emulate. Alina, a teenage girl who had been orphaned when her family's ranch was attacked by raiders, brought advanced needlework skills and knowledge of herbal medicine that complemented the children's growing expertise in desert survival. Her presence also provided Catherine with the kind of female companionship and assistance that made managing their ever-expanding household more manageable. By the 5th anniversary of the original rescue, their family had grown to include 22 children, ranging in age from infancy to 16. The house had been expanded multiple times, with additional wings and outbuildings that created a small compound capable of housing what had become essentially a village organized around child welfare and mutual support. The economic sustainability of their operation had evolved far beyond the simple farming and livestock raising that had initially supported them. Marcus's reputation as a tracker and guide brought steady income from territorial surveys and mapping expeditions. Catherine had established a correspondence school that served isolated frontier families throughout the region. The older children contributed through various enterprises, from David's animal healing practice to Samuel's increasingly sophisticated agricultural innovations. But perhaps most importantly, their success had inspired the creation of similar communities throughout the American West. Reports reached them regularly of other groups attempting to replicate their model: extended families organized around child welfare, sustainable agriculture, and mutual support rather than traditional blood relationships or economic exploitation. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s but still making regular visits to check on his grandchildren, often marveled at how their experiment in alternative family structure had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. "What you've created here," he told Marcus during one of their evening conversations, "is more than just a successful household. You've proven that children can thrive in environments that prioritize their welfare over conventional expectations." The territorial recognition they had initially accepted with some reluctance had evolved into formal partnerships that brought both resources and responsibilities. Their compound served as a training center for social workers and child welfare officials from across the region. Educational researchers came to study their innovative approaches to schooling children from diverse backgrounds and traumatic experiences. Even federal officials from Washington had visited to assess whether their model might be applicable to Indian reservation schools and urban orphanages. But for all the external recognition and success, the heart of their community remained the bonds between the children who had been saved and the adults who had chosen to dedicate their lives to creating something unprecedented. The evening gatherings that had begun as practical meetings to discuss household logistics had evolved into rich cultural exchanges where stories were shared, music was performed, and the children who had survived impossible circumstances were encouraged to dream about futures that seemed limitless. Rebecca, now a confident 10-year-old whose early rescue had become family legend, often served as spokesperson when visitors came to learn about their community. Her presentations, delivered with the poise of someone who had never doubted her worth or place in the world, typically concluded with observations that revealed the profound impact of her unusual upbringing. "People ask us what it's like to live in such a big family," she would say, gesturing toward her siblings who ranged from toddlers to teenagers. "But we don't think of ourselves as big or unusual. We think of ourselves as lucky that we found each other, lucky that someone cared enough to save us, and lucky that we get to help save other children who need families." The wisdom contained in her simple statements often moved adult visitors to tears, but for Rebecca and her siblings, such perspectives were simply normal. They had grown up understanding that family was something you built through choice and commitment, that survival required cooperation and mutual support, and that individual strength came from knowing you were part of something larger than yourself. As Marcus approached his 45th birthday, he sometimes marveled at the transformation his life had undergone since that fateful day when he heard crying in Devil's Canyon. The solitary cowboy who had sought escape from human connection in the vast emptiness of the desert had become the patriarch of a community that exemplified the best possibilities of frontier society. His relationship with Catherine had deepened into the kind of partnership that sustained not just their marriage, but their extended family stability. Their individual strengths, his practical knowledge of survival, and her educational expertise, had combined to create child-rearing approaches that prepared their children for success in any environment they might encounter. The children who had once faced death in the desert had become young people whose confidence and capabilities were recognized throughout the territory. They served as mentors for newer arrivals, teachers for younger siblings, and ambassadors for the possibility that traumatic beginnings could lead to extraordinary futures. And somewhere in the desert hills that surrounded their thriving community, the mountain lioness who had once protected little David had perhaps found her own family and her own peace. Marcus occasionally found tracks that suggested large cats still used the water sources near their property, and he chose to believe that the wilderness they had learned to call home continued to harbor the kind of mysterious connections between species that had made his children's survival possible. In the end, 12 abandoned babies had not just been saved from death in the desert, they had become the catalyst for creating something unprecedented in the American West, a family built on choice, sustained by love, and dedicated to the proposition that every child deserved not just survival, but the chance to thrive in a community that would never abandon them to face the wilderness alone. Their story had become proof that individual courage could transform not just immediate circumstances, but entire communities, and that the bonds forged in crisis could become the foundation for futures that exceeded everyone's most optimistic dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.